The phone call came on a Tuesday evening in March, just as Linda Carver was clearing the dinner dishes. She'd been alone in the house for 3 years now, ever since her husband passed, and Tuesday evenings had become quiet, predictable affairs. The kind of nights where silence pressed against the windows like a living thing, where the ticking of the kitchen clock seemed impossibly loud. She was thinking about starting a crossword puzzle, something to occupy her mind before bed, when the landline rang. Nobody called the house phone anymore. Most of her friends had moved on to cell phones years ago, and her daughter rarely bothered with anything but texting. The voice on the other end was unfamiliar, rough around the edges, speaking with the careful cadence of someone choosing every word with deliberation. "Is this Linda Carver?" he asked. "Yes, who's calling?" She set down the dish towel, and something in her chest tightened immediately. There was an electricity in her body that she hadn't felt in years, the electricity of dread mixed with desperate, irrational hope. "My name is James Hartley. I'm calling because I have information about your son, about Michael." 20 years. That's how long it had been since Michael disappeared from the parking lot of Riverside High School in Portland, Oregon. He was 16 years old then, a quiet junior with sandy blonde hair and his father's serious eyes. He had a part-time job at the local grocery store, earning money to save for a used camera he wanted. He'd spent hours studying tide pools at Cannon Beach during the summers, collecting shells and sketching sea stars in a worn notebook. His guidance counselor said he had the grades to attend any university he wanted. He had plans to study marine biology, wanted to work for NOAA, maybe travel to research stations around the world. He'd gone to school that morning in March like any other day. Linda remembered making him toast with jam, remembered him grabbing his backpack and mumbling something about a history test. He never came home. The police had searched for weeks. Volunteers organized search parties that combed through the forests surrounding Portland. Flyers with Michael's face appeared on telephone poles and in store windows. Local news stations ran stories about the missing boy. But as days turned into weeks and weeks into months, the intensity faded. The police eventually concluded that Michael had run away, that perhaps he'd gotten into trouble they didn't know about. One detective suggested, with barely concealed disdain, that maybe he'd simply wanted to escape and had hitchhiked to California. Linda had spent 20 years knowing in her bones that this wasn't true, but unable to prove it. "What do you know about my son?" Linda asked, her voice barely steady. "I knew him," the man continued. We were together when it happened, when he was taken. I've been carrying this for 2 decades, Mrs. Carver, and I can't do it anymore. The weight of it is crushing me. I need to tell someone. I need to tell you the truth. If you're following along with this mystery, please subscribe to our channel and drop a comment below, telling us where you're watching from. Your support means everything to us, and it helps us bring you more stories about real disappearances and the families searching for answers. Now let's continue with what happened that day. Within the hour, James Hartley was sitting in her living room, a modest space with worn furniture and family photographs on the mantel, including several of Michael at different ages. James was a gaunt man in his late 50s with weathered skin creased by years of sun exposure and worry. His hands moved constantly, fidgeting with the fabric of his jeans, running through his thinning gray hair. He'd driven up from California, he explained, from a small town in the Sierra Nevada foothills where he'd been living quietly for the past 15 years. He worked as a landscape contractor, kept mostly to himself, didn't maintain close friendships. But he'd seen something on the news, some cold case re-examination program that had featured Michael's photograph, and it had triggered something in him. A conscience he thought he'd successfully buried all those years ago, lodged deep beneath layers of rationalization and self-preservation. "I need you to understand something first," James said, his eyes finally meeting hers. "I was a coward. I was 17 years old, and I was terrified, and I let fear make my choices for me. What I'm about to tell you, I should have told this to the police 20 years ago. Michael was my friend. He was kind to me when nobody else was, and I failed him when it mattered most. Linda sat across from him, her hands folded tightly in her lap. She was afraid to move, afraid to breathe, as if any sudden motion might shatter whatever truth he was about to reveal. Michael and I met at Riverside High in the fall of 1993, James began. We had the same lunch period. He sat alone most days, reading or sketching in a notebook. I was getting bullied pretty badly. I was overweight, I wore glasses, I didn't fit in with the popular crowd. Most kids just ignored me or made jokes, but Michael never did. He asked if he could sit with me one day, just like that. No big deal. He started bringing 2 sandwiches to lunch and sharing one with me. We talked about marine biology and science fiction books. He lent me his copy of 20,000 Leagues Under the Sea. We became real friends. James's voice cracked slightly as he continued. In early 1994, there were these older boys, Danny Volkert, his brother Frank, and a kid named Trevor Moss. They were 17, 18 years old. They dropped out of school and were dealing drugs, small-time stuff mostly, marijuana and some cocaine. They were connected to people who dealt in bigger operations, people who weren't to be crossed. One day, they approached Michael in the bathroom at school. They wanted him to steal something from the school office. What did they want him to steal? Linda asked, her voice thin and distant. Attendance records, grades, information about students and their families. They said they could use the information for blackmail, targeting kids from wealthy families, threatening to alter their grades or expose information about absences. Michael refused immediately. He told them no, that he wouldn't do it. He said it was wrong, and he wasn't going to help them with something illegal. James paused, as if gathering strength. Danny Volkert didn't handle rejection well. He was the type of kid who believed the world owed him something, that rules were for people who couldn't take what they wanted. When Michael said no, Danny saw it as disrespect, a challenge to his authority. The investigation that followed Michael's disappearance in March 1994 had been thorough initially, but ultimately fruitless. Detective Raymond Sullivan had interviewed everyone. Michael's teachers, his co-workers at the grocery store, his classmates, girls who might have been romantic interests, coaches of clubs he'd joined. The police had taken bloodhounds to the forests, had dredged the nearby creek, had distributed hundreds of flyers. But nobody mentioned the Volkert brothers or Trevor Moss in connection with Michael's disappearance. Nobody mentioned any confrontation in the parking lot. Nobody seemed to know anything. James explained why, during that evening in Linda's living room, they'd moved. Within a week of Michael's disappearance, Danny and Frank Volkert had relocated to Arizona with their entire family. Their parents, a younger sister, all of them packed into a moving truck and gone. The official reason was that their father had found better work opportunities in Phoenix. But James had overheard conversations. He'd pieced together enough to understand that the move was sudden, urgent, designed to put distance between the Volkert family and whatever had happened in that parking lot. Trevor Moss's parents had sent him to live with relatives in Washington state, claiming he needed a change of scenery, that he'd been falling into bad company. The connections had slipped through the cracks of an investigation that had no leads, no witnesses willing to come forward, and a small police department that couldn't follow suspects across state lines without evidence. "What happened to Michael?" Linda asked, her voice breaking despite her attempt to remain composed. "After they confronted him, did they hurt him? Is he—" She couldn't finish the question. The word dead felt too final, too absolute. "I don't know for certain," James said. And Linda heard the truth in those words, and also heard the terrible, devastating uncertainty that he'd carried for 2 decades. "I was 17 years old and terrified. I watched from a distance. I was too scared to get involved, too scared of what Danny might do to me if I interfered. After they confronted him in the parking lot, Michael ran. I watched him run toward the woods beyond the parking lot, the ones that bordered the school property. I never saw him again. But in the weeks after, before the Volkerts moved away, I overheard Danny and Frank talking in the hallway. They mentioned something about sending a message and the problem being solved. I was too afraid to tell anyone. My parents had problems of their own. My father was drinking heavily. My mother was working double shifts at the hospital. I didn't want to bring trouble into my life. I moved away the following year, joined the military, tried to forget everything about Portland and everyone who'd known me here. James detailed the decades that followed, years of PTSD, of nightmares where he saw Michael's face, of therapy sessions where he danced around the truth without ever quite confessing it. He'd had 2 marriages that failed because he couldn't explain the darkness that lived inside him, the weight of his silence. He'd become a landscape contractor in California, living a quiet life, keeping to himself, drinking too much wine on Friday nights while watching the sunset over the mountains. And then one evening, 6 months ago, he'd seen Michael's face on a true crime documentary about cold cases. The photograph was from his school yearbook. Michael at 16, solemn and serious, his hair styled in the fashion of 1994. The documentary had spent 10 minutes on his disappearance, interviewing Linda, interviewing his former teachers, discussing the theories that had emerged over the years. "I know this is late," James said, and Linda could see genuine remorse in his expression. "I know it doesn't bring him back. I know it doesn't undo anything, but you deserve the truth about what happened that day. And maybe after all these years, someone should finally talk to the Volkert brothers and find out what they're hiding." When Detective Raymond Powell arrived at Linda's house the next morning, she'd already called the police department 3 times. Powell was in his 60s now, one of the last detectives still working at the Portland Police Bureau who remembered Michael's case. He'd kept the file on his desk for years, had revisited it dozens of times, always feeling the frustration of dead ends and missing witnesses. He treated James Hartley with cautious skepticism during the initial interview. 20-year-old testimonies were notoriously unreliable, colored by time and the frailty of human memory. Yet something in James's account had the ring of truth to it. His details were specific, but not too perfect. His emotions seemed genuine rather than performed. The investigation began quietly. Detective Powell didn't immediately pursue Danny Volkert aggressively. Instead, he worked backward, trying to corroborate James's account. He pulled old-school records and found that, yes, indeed, the Volkert family had relocated to Arizona in late March 1994, just days after Michael's disappearance. He interviewed teachers who'd been at Riverside High 20 years earlier. Most were retired now, but they remembered the Volkert brothers as troublemakers. One chemistry teacher recalled that Danny Volkert had been suspended multiple times for drug possession. A guidance counselor remembered that Frank had dropped out 2 weeks before Michael disappeared. Danny Volkert was now 52 years old and living in Scottsdale, Arizona. A quick background check revealed that he was a construction manager with a wife, 3 adult children, and a mortgage on a 4-bedroom house in an upscale neighborhood. He had no criminal record, no arrests, no convictions, nothing but a clean slate that suggested he'd managed to leave his youthful indiscretions far behind. When Powell called the Scottsdale police and asked them to conduct an interview with Danny Volkert, the response was immediate and emphatic. Volkert denied ever knowing Michael Carver. He denied any involvement in any disappearance. He denied being in Portland in March 1994, claimed he'd been living in Arizona since late 1993, that his father had arranged a job transfer with his company. He refused to discuss his whereabouts on the specific day Michael disappeared without a lawyer present. Frank Volkert was harder to locate. He'd dropped off the radar years ago. No driver's license renewal, no tax records, no known employment history. He'd become a ghost, living beneath the surface of official records. It took the marshals 3 weeks of searching before they finally found him living under an assumed name in rural Nevada, in a trailer park outside a small town called Battle Mountain. He was working as a mechanic at a local repair shop, living a life of deliberate obscurity. When confronted by the authorities, he became hostile and aggressive, threatening to sue for harassment and claiming he had nothing to do with any disappearance. Trevor Moss's trail was easier to follow but led nowhere useful. He'd moved to California after his time in Washington and had been killed in a single-car accident in 2003. Crashed his truck into a highway overpass on Interstate 5 near Redding. He'd been drunk, according to the accident report. No investigation into his death had uncovered anything suspicious. It appeared to be a straightforward tragedy of a man driving recklessly while intoxicated. Yet as Detective Powell dug deeper into the records from 1994, something peculiar began to emerge. There were gaps in the case file, interview notes that seemed incomplete, physical evidence logs that didn't match the documentation. Someone had been careful, methodical in obscuring details. The original detective on the case had been Thomas Hendricks, now retired and living in Seattle. Powell drove up to see him, bringing coffee and donuts, approaching the meeting with respect for a fellow officer. Hendricks was reluctant to talk initially, but eventually, with some gentle pressure and the promise of confidentiality, he admitted that there had been pressure from above to close the investigation quietly. A superintendent's daughter had been involved with one of the Volkert brothers, dating him seriously, according to rumors. There were complicated family connections throughout the town's hierarchy, subtle relationships of obligation and reciprocal silence. The superintendent had suggested to the police chief that perhaps the investigation was pursuing false leads, that maybe Michael had simply run away. Without strong evidence or witnesses willing to testify, the case had quietly been shelved. "I wasn't proud of it," Hendricks said, his voice heavy with the weight of 20 years of guilt. "But I was a younger man then, and I cared about my career. The pressure came from the top, and I didn't have the courage to resist it." The truth, it seemed, had been buried not just by the passage of time, but by deliberate erasure. Linda threw herself into helping Detective Powell reconstruct the case. She took a leave of absence from her job as a medical secretary and spent her days in libraries and courthouse records rooms, tracing the Volkert family's movements, documenting their timeline. She spoke to old neighbors who still lived on the street where she and Michael had grown up. She tracked down the parents of Michael's classmates, people she hadn't spoken to in 2 decades, and carefully asked them if they remembered anything about March 1994, about Danny and Frank Volkert, about any rumors or overheard conversations that might have seemed insignificant at the time, but now carried weight and meaning. Slowly, piece by piece, a picture emerged that contradicted the official narrative that had been accepted 20 years earlier. A neighbor recalled seeing a moving truck at the Volkert house late one night, pulling away in darkness. A former teacher remembered Danny Volkert bragging about going to Arizona, how he claimed he could start fresh somewhere nobody knew him. Michael's best friend from middle school, a woman named Patricia who now lived in Eugene, remembered that in the days after Michael disappeared, she'd heard whispers that he'd gotten into trouble, that maybe he'd run away to escape something. But nobody had ever provided details about what that trouble might be. Then came the call that changed everything. A woman named Susan Volkert, Frank Volkert's ex-girlfriend from the 1990s, reached out through a private investigator Linda had hired. Susan had seen something about the cold case investigation online and recognized the names. She lived in Portland now, had moved back 5 years ago. She claimed she had information about Michael, information she'd kept quiet for decades because she'd been afraid of Frank and his family, of people who knew them, of consequences she couldn't predict. She would only speak to Linda directly, face to face, not to police, not to investigators. She wanted Linda to understand what had really happened, she said, from someone who had loved one of the men involved and who couldn't carry the secret any longer. They met in a coffee shop on a grey afternoon in April at a small independent place called Brew Haven in northeast Portland. Susan was a thin woman in her early 50s, with blonde hair turning grey and a nervous energy that manifested in constant fidgeting. She ordered tea she didn't drink, stirred sugar into it repeatedly, and spoke in hushed tones despite the cafe being nearly empty at 3 o'clock on a Tuesday. "I dated Frank from 1992 to 1996, Susan began. "I was young and stupid, and he was charming when he wanted to be. I didn't know about his involvement with drugs or crime until I was already in the relationship. By then, I was in love, or I thought I was. I rationalized everything, his mood swings, his violent outbursts, his friends who scared me. I told myself he was different with me, that I was special, that I could change him if I loved him enough." Linda listened, not interrupting, letting Susan tell the story at her own pace. "After we broke up, I moved to California to get away from him. I wanted to forget that entire period of my life, the chaos, the fear, the things I'd witnessed and done that I wasn't proud of. I built a new life, got married, had kids, divorced. I came back to Portland a few years ago to help my aging mother, and I realized I couldn't keep carrying this weight. I needed to tell someone what Frank had told me, what I'd kept quiet about for so long." Susan took a sip of her tea, gathering courage. "Frank told me once, after we'd been drinking, that he and Danny had made a terrible mistake when they were younger, something that had changed the trajectory of their entire lives. He said they'd been involved in a situation that got out of hand, that someone had died, and they'd covered it up. He didn't give me details at first. He was too afraid of what might happen if he talked about it. But later, after we'd broken up and I was preparing to move away, he came to my apartment one last time. I think he wanted forgiveness, or maybe confession. He said that in 1994, he and Danny had confronted a kid at their high school, a kid who'd refused to do something for them. There was an altercation, and the kid had been hurt. They panicked. They moved him. They buried him." "Did he tell you where?" Linda asked, her voice barely audible. "He said somewhere on the old logging road east of town, somewhere nobody went anymore. He said they covered it carefully, deep enough that nobody would find it. But he also said that Danny had written about it, in a journal. He kept a journal where he documented everything that happened that day, and in the days after. Frank said Danny was tormented by guilt, even though he refused to confess or face consequences. The excavation took 3 weeks to organize. Search warrants were obtained, environmental impact assessments conducted, and the County Forestry Service consulted about the condition of the old logging road. Forensic teams assembled from Portland State University, from the County Medical Examiner's Office, from the State Police. On a cold morning in May, beneath grey skies threatening rain, a backhoe began carefully turning over the earth on a forgotten stretch of road that had become overgrown with Douglas firs and tangled brush, with salal and sword ferns reclaiming the land that human hands had abandoned 2 decades earlier. They found Michael Carver's remains buried under 3 feet of soil, wrapped in a blue tarp that had long since rotted away. The bones were scattered but largely intact, preserved in the acidic Oregon soil. The medical examiner confirmed that he'd died from blunt force trauma to the head, consistent with a fall from a height of 4 to 5 feet onto hard ground. The remains had been in the ground for approximately 20 years, give or take a few months. When the police brought Danny Volkert in for questioning with this new evidence, he confessed immediately. He'd apparently spent 20 years in a state of psychological torment, unable to hold the secret any longer now that it had been exposed. In a statement that lasted 4 hours, he provided details about that day in March 1994, how he and Frank had confronted Michael in the parking lot, how Michael had refused their demands, how Michael had tried to run, how Danny had pushed him in anger and frustration, how Michael had fallen backward and struck his head on the concrete curb that bordered the parking lot. "I didn't mean to kill him," Danny said, his voice hollow and distant. "We just wanted to scare him, to make him understand that we weren't people to be refused. He ran, and I pushed him, and he fell. There was so much blood. We panicked. We loaded him into the back of the truck and drove him out to that logging road. We thought if we buried him somewhere remote, if we left town, nobody would ever connect us to his disappearance. We were kids. We were stupid. We were scared." Frank Volkert was brought back from Nevada and charged as an accessory. He maintained his innocence initially, but eventually offered a statement corroborating Danny's account. He'd been present at the parking lot, he admitted. He'd helped load Michael into the truck. He'd helped dig the grave. But he claimed Danny had been the one who pushed Michael, that it had been an accident, that he'd been in shock and simply followed Danny's lead. The case against both brothers was circumstantial but convincing. The confession, the physical evidence of Michael's remains, the testimony of James Hartley and Susan Volkert, the pattern of flight and concealment that had lasted 2 decades. 3 months later, on a humid August evening, Linda Carver stood at her son's grave in the Pacific View Cemetery in Portland. It was a plot she'd purchased years ago as an act of faith and defiance, a small space where she could grieve even without a body to mourn. She'd place flowers there on his birthday every year, fresh roses or tulips depending on the season. Now, finally, Michael was home, his ashes interred in the earth beneath a headstone that read, "Michael James Carver, 1978-1994. Beloved son, forever remembered." Detective Powell stood beside her, wearing civilian clothes. He'd retired 3 months after the case was closed, unable to reconcile his career's worth of compromises and silences with the truth that had finally come to light. He'd spent 35 years in law enforcement, and he'd decided he couldn't continue working within a system that permitted injustice to be buried beneath bureaucratic convenience. "I'm sorry it took so long," he said. Linda placed a hand on the cold marble of Michael's headstone. She traced the letters of his name with her fingers. "He's not here," she said quietly, as if speaking to Powell or to herself, or to something larger than both of them. "Not really, but at least now I know. At least now the running stops." She thought about James Hartley, now in intensive therapy and preparing to testify against the Volkert brothers at trial. She thought about the weight he'd carried for 20 years, about the moment when conscience finally overwhelmed fear. She thought about Patricia, now Susan, a woman who'd loved one of the criminals and had finally found the courage to speak truth, even though it meant betraying someone she'd once cared for. She thought about Detective Powell, sacrificing the pension and benefits of his final years of service, rather than continue working within a system that had permitted injustice. Michael had been 16 years old. He'd refused to do something wrong, refused to participate in extortion and blackmail, refused to compromise his integrity even when threatened. In a better world, that act of moral courage would have been celebrated and protected. Instead, it had cost him his life and had been buried along with his body, hidden beneath layers of fear and complicity and willful blindness from people in power who preferred silence to justice. But now, 20 years later, the earth had finally given up its secret. The forest had released what it had been forced to hold. Michael Carver's name, once erased from the official record, from the news cycles, from the town's collective memory, was finally spoken again, not as a mystery to be dismissed, not as a cold case gathering dust, but as the story of a boy who had been real, who had mattered deeply, whose death would no longer be forgotten or diminished. The investigation continued, but Linda stopped attending the procedural hearings. She didn't need to hear the details repeated. She already knew the truth, and she was learning that truth alone wasn't enough to heal. What mattered now was moving forward, was honoring Michael not just by solving the mystery of his death, but by living, by speaking his name, by telling his story, by refusing to let his memory be diminished by time or indifference.